Hi there, my name's Victoria Snaith and I'm the director of Dreadfuls Theatre. In this blog today I discuss my involvement with the Perkelt music video, my fairy tale influences and why the art form of puppetry is here to stay. On first listening to the song, I imagined a man or woman who was compelled to dance. This person was so filled with emotion they were almost literally swept up in a gust of wind and taken away. This reminded me strongly of the Hans Christian Andersen story, The Red Shoes. In The Red Shoes, Karen, a peasant girl, is given a pair of red shoes by her new adoptive mother. The shoes are by far the most luxurious thing Karen has ever owned, and she wears them constantly. At a party, a mysterious man tells Karen her red shoes are beautiful. So delighted with the compliment, she decides to dance with him at the party. But soon she realises the shoes are dancing by themselves. Try as Karen may, she cannot remove them. She continues to dance. She becomes tired and sore but is unable to stop. She dances away from the party, out of her town, across the fields, and dances through the land. Her feet are bleeding and blistered by the time she meets the woodcutter. Karen explains she cannot remove the shoes and she begs him to chop off her feet with his axe. He agrees. Although I drew heavily from the red shoes, the shoes in our story are not endowed with magic like Karen's. The magic in our story comes in the form of those that make the forest their home. The fairies and elves, the trolls and bogles, the wood sprites, and the water nymphs. These magical creatures are familiar to us. We have read about them, seen them on TV, and in almost every Disney film. But my version of these characters comes from a much earlier interpretation. Let me explain. Scholars of fairy tales make a distinction between oral fairy tales, otherwise known as folk tales, and literary fairy tales. The first are considered anonymous and undateable. The latter have an author and are dated. Over the centuries, these branches have grown ever closer to one another, until it can be argued that in today's society, all fairy tales are literary fairy tales, whether they are written down, presented in theatre, or captured for film and television. What I was most interested in when creating our fairy tale creatures was the oral fairy tales, before the rules of characters, environments, and plot was solidified. I was interested in how these creatures began, from where these myths came. It has been argued by literary historians that these creatures of oral fairy tales, such as witches, banshees, fairies, and talking animals, have a very real and understandable origin. The idea these scholars present is that our ancestors had to find meaning within that which they could not explain. Banshees were the sound of winds at night, but unable to explain why the wind whistles through the trees, they gave it a semi-human form, something to which they could relate. Another example is that of fairies. These small, mischievous, human-like creatures that play tricks on humans, such as hiding those shoes you've been searching for, but were sure you had only put them down 5 minutes ago, can be explained away by mere forgetfulness. These anthropomorphic characters in oral fairy tales were the inspiration for our puppets. We wanted to move away from the magic of the shoes, as I mentioned earlier, and use the environment as the catalyst for creating our puppets. The puppets couldn't just be random fairy tale characters though. I had a special request from the band asking me to make a puppet based on each member, which meant 4 puppets based on 4 people, each with their own differing style. Will Connor and Pavlina Bastlova were the first 2 members of Perkelt to be immortalised in puppet format. I knew Will had to have horns and be very organic looking, while Pavlina needed to be fey-like and ethereal. After passing over the base heads to Susie, she breathed further life into the designs by adding detailing. Stepan, with his pointed nose and feathers in his hair, was an obvious choice for a bird. And finally, David, with his strong jaw, would be made out of stone. When deciding how to represent these creatures on film, I had considered a few different options, such as dancers in face paint, actors in masks, animation. But in the end, the answer was easy: puppets. According to the Victoria and Albert Museum, there is evidence that puppetry has been a part of Britain's artistic culture for over 600 years. For example, in a 14th century manuscript for Romance of Alexander, there are illustrations of hand puppets akin to Punch and Judy. 600 years later, and our interest in puppetry has not declined. More recently, we have seen puppets in Edmondson's Coram Boy and the award-winning theatre show Warhorse, as well as the 90s film Being John Malkovich. In my experience, one of the reasons for the public's long-standing interest in puppetry is the way puppetry layers artistic mastery. When watching a theatre show or film with puppets, one is marvelling at the skill of the puppeteer, the way the puppet interacts with the human cast members. We wonder how a puppet's face can convey so many expressions, and we admire the craftsmanship of the puppet itself. It does not matter if you can see the puppeteer or the strings or the sticks. Those elements are what grounds the audience. They enable them to see the layers of the puppet's artistry. To be complicit in the magic of puppetry, and accepting that it is a puppet, is very satisfying. I have heard the longevity of puppetry called into question many times. There are people who do not understand why I would choose puppets over other mediums. They express the opinion that puppetry is a dying art form. I beg to differ. I think puppetry has done something very clever in the last 50 years. Instead of trying to compete with other art forms, it has joined forces with them. Puppetry at one time only existed in puppet theatres, but now you can see puppets in all arts. I have seen puppets act alongside opera singers, dancers, and actors in film and television. It is my hope that puppetry will continue to work alongside these other art forms, and will gain the respect in the public and professional realms that it deserves.